All right, welcome back. This is the Something About Your podcast. I am your host. I'm Kent Lindstrom. My guests today are Hunter and Satya. How are you guys doing?
We're doing great.
We're
Kent,
super.
Kent, we've known you for a while, huh?
I know this is fantastic, and I
Back
say
before any of us were writing checks.
exactly. Now we all have partners now too. We'll talk about what that looks like. I say Hunter and Satya. I'm not just being casual. In Silicon Valley, you can say Hunter and Satya, and people know what you're talking about. Like Simon and Garfunkel. Keeping it real for the kids. Hunter Walk and Satya Patel are the founders of Homebrew, which is one of the most iconic, successful seed venture firms in Silicon Valley, and they're taking it into a new transition now. But boy, you guys have built something kind of amazing.
Well, thank you for that. I was going to say I didn't expect to hear anything like that until my eulogy. So I hope I don't have to. Well, I guess I wouldn't hear that again on my eulogy. Kind words. I think we've been doing this now for 11 years. I mean, look, I think what is important to us, and maybe why it resonates with some of our peers and founders, is we are running our own playbook. And I think coming out of a phase of venture where maybe, there was only one playbook that most funds were running, which was, sort of raise money, hype your portfolio, and raise even more money and keep doing, and, continue at an accelerated cycle. I think we've made some deliberate changes, to what we think venture should be. And it's not sort of carrying the tablets down from the mountains, to suggest the way the industry should function, but I think we know who we are, and
you have as I understand it, you have since you started. How did, and I love these origin stories. So you guys both come to this from different points of view. Obviously, it's not Andreessen, it's Andreessen Horowitz, right? What you had two different paths, right? Hunter, you were mostly a product person. Satya, you'd actually managed to do venture capital in your career beforehand. How do you come together and decide that this is a good idea, given the range of things that either of you could do, and given the range of people that either of you could work with? I mean, I'm sure you met a million people at Google. I'm sure you met a million founders in venture who you could have partnered with. But in all the world, you didn't. You can't, it's the two of you and it's Homebrew.
I think the reason we came together and the reason it's worked so well, at least for the two of us, is because at the foundation of it all is the relationship that Hunter and I had when we started Homebrew. Because the first decision we made when we decided to do what eventually became Homebrew was really the decision to work together again. And so we had the good fortune of sitting a few feet from each other at Google. I think everybody who has worked in a corporation or enterprise of any kind leaves a job and has the handful of people that they'd love to work with again. And we actually not only had that in mind, but tried to do that over the course of time. So when I was at Battery Ventures, I tried to get Hunter to leave YouTube and come be an EIR and start a company. We ended up doing a bunch of angel investing together. Our wives became friends and like each other more than they like us. And so there was a bunch of foundation in place that allowed us to first make the decision that we wanted to work together again. And then kind of the second, third, and fourth decisions led to what eventually became Homebrew. But we didn't set out to be venture capitalists, and we certainly didn't start out, with the idea of raising a fund. The core of what works about Homebrew and for the two of us is that we had a relationship where we believed that 1 + 1 = 3, that we each understood what we wanted to accomplish over the long term and how we wanted to spend our time in the short term. And so I think the thing that we appreciate about Homebrew, and to your earlier question, what we think others might appreciate, is that ultimately Homebrew is a very selfish exercise for us. And as a result, is very authentic to us because it really is built around the work we want to do, how we want to spend our time, and the relationship between the two of us. And we've just been really lucky that has ended up resonating with people outside of Homebrew.
Yeah, I'll go even a little bit further, Ken. It wasn't even so much of like, oh, we were both thinking about venture and we just happened to be each other's puzzle pieces. I think if you had asked us towards the end of 2012, when Satya left Twitter, where he was running product, and I was finally thinking about leaving Google, like either of you thinking about venture as your next thing? I think both of us would have said no independently.
Really?
And so when we started talking, when he left Twitter and I said, hey, you should know something, I'm thinking about leaving Google, maybe we finally had that, blank sheet of paper moment. It wasn't, hey, we should raise that fund we always were talking about, or even sort of, powering through ideas. It was a little bit more foundational, as Satya said. And the thing that we realized was, one, we wanted to work together, like something optimizing for us spending time together versus, just being, each leading a team and being part of the same larger structure. It's like, no, we want to sit next to each other. Yeah. The second thing was we were comfortable making a 20-year decision, not just a 2-year decision. So I was like, okay, we can embrace something that should theoretically be the rest of our career, so to speak. The third thing that we realized that we had in common was whether it was on org charts or cap tables, we'd always enjoyed the earliest years of companies and products. And so, wow, wouldn't it be kind of interesting if we could spend, the next 20 years sitting next to one another, sort of perpetually at the earliest stages of companies? Then that really only had two other questions. One was like, so are there, your companies or somebody else's companies? We were smart enough to know that they should be somebody else's companies versus ours. And then there was an easy answer to the next question, which was, well, what's the business model? Like, well, it turns out there's this business model called venture capital. Yeah. And so when we think about what we started out as, or even how we've evolved, like you have to go pretty far down the stack to actually see what's changed. It's just the business model changes from time to time. Everything else, working together, for the rest of our careers, at the earliest stages of other people's companies, like that's pretty enduring. That's written in pen, maybe even Sharpie marker. These sort of like, what do founders need and how do you monetize your time in doing that work? Yeah. That we sort of put in pencil and are willing to reconsider, phase over phase.
Do you think most people know what it is? And I'm talking very specifically about a two-person, two-partner venture firm. Know what that relationship is. In contrast, you could start a company and you could be the CFO and you could run a team and I'll be the CEO or however that works. But what a sort of, intimate's not the right word, but it's a long-term relationship where you're working together as equals every day. And everything you're thinking about is the same thing. Like it's the same problem. The same thing is happening to you at the same time for year after year. Did you know that that's what it was as you went into it?
I mean, I think Satya's been part of larger partnerships before, at venture firms. So he's seen a lot of those dynamics on sort of generally and, how they work, don't work. We know a lot of friends in venture, but I think we were even thinking about it, slightly different, which is the sense of lots of venture firms add partners or remove partners and continue on, for the better or worse. Yeah. We sort of went into it believing that Homebrew only exists when there's two of us working on it. And that in order to embrace that, well, we had to understand that, we couldn't just take the relationship for granted, that you have to sort of continue to put time and effort into understanding one another, wanting one another to be the best version of themselves, seeing each other as people, not just as GPs or, deal attribution stats. Yeah. And so, I think we went in with some benefits, experience, being sort of similar age, similar life stages, a bunch of the things that can sometimes trip partnerships up when people don't realize that they should have talked about those things or that those things might diverge over time. Yeah. But we don't take anything for granted. When we were fundraising for the first fund, obviously we heard, we were thankful enough to hear a handful of yeses from partners that we've been in business, with since that time. But of course, we also heard no's. And you know what the number one reason people turned us down was? It was, well, for funds of your size, sub $100 million, we either like to, half of the people were like, we only like to see one key man. We like to see one managing partner. Wow. You can have more partners, but we really want to know who we're betting on. And we were like, well, sorry, like we were, unless you want to take this, this lunch or this meeting and let us convince you otherwise, like we're equal partners and we're going into this. And we were just fortunate that the other half of the LPs we talked to, were like, we love when there's, two partners. It's a hard job. You make each other better, so on and so forth. So, 50% of the potential investors in Homebrew One dropped off, just because we were sitting next to each other and it wasn't one of us, sort of taking the lead, so to speak.
Oh yeah. That's one of the things we learned in fundraising is like, if people don't want what you got, like move on down the road because you're not going to convince them otherwise.
And it was all biased. Like, I don't think there was any empirical evidence. This was still early enough in seed that there weren't a lot of examples of like seed stage institutional funds that had lasted a while. Yeah. And so I think the people who wanted one partner probably were the ones who had invested in like Chris Sacca at lowercase, or, previously like Jeff Clavier, well, that was still very much a Jeff show, that type of thing. And people who like more than one partners were probably in early first round or things like that. And so they're probably just pattern matching off of like what made them money before.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know how people do it. I mean, they do it. Like, there's hugely successful single partner firms, but like, given how it goes and the ups and the downs and the things, like, I can't conceive of it. I can't conceive of doing a
Well, it's
company
like solo
either.
founders, right? You want to,
Yeah.
it's like we've backed solo founders, we'll continue to back solo founders, but you want to know if they know what they're getting into, right? I
Yeah.
think we see as many, we have, besides making historically small personal checks as LPs into other people's funds, we've also started with some of our industry colleagues and a great managing director named Lisa Colley started a fund of funds called Screendoor that backs sort of next generation emerging managers. And so we have a pretty good perspective from, on the early landscape from as LPs also. And like we are very wary of partnerships where it's sort of you're smashing people together because it looks good in a deck, but they don't know what they're getting into, right? Like I think it's even harder it's even harder from a venture standpoint to deal with sort of, partner breakups than it is sometimes in a startup.
Well, I was going to say, all these years later, that's what we get is LPs look at us and think, okay, you guys worked together for 15 years. You're probably, anything's possible. You're probably not going to break up now. And half of it is like, you guys know what works together. You guys know what the flaws are of each other, right? You're not.
I remember when Satya and I'm monopolizing, but when Satya and I were negotiating our first, like, what do you call it, like LPA type of thing. So obviously, we were with institutional investors, so you kind of know what you're going to get. A bunch of things that need, theoretically need a bunch of approvals to do, or like your LPAC, your LP advisory committee is going to vote and stuff. And we are very respectful. Like we love our working with our LPs. So of course, there's some things that like we understand why they want them there as safeguards. They're large institutions, but you negotiate them so that you can reach a point where like you feel like you can run your business without having to always go back to your LPs. And fortunately, it's been a great relationship. But I remember the one thing that we chose not to aggressively negotiate was what happens if one of you leaves.
Yeah.
And the idea was, well, if one of you leave, like Homebrew can only continue with an LPAC vote, so our largest, most important investors would be able to get together and say like, yes, you should continue or not. And the reason we didn't, sort of heavily negotiate that was like, we wanted that there. Like, we're sort of looked at one another and said like, well, if we break up, there shouldn't be a Homebrew, and definitely not without sort of, talking to our investors, but like, this is sort of a dead man trigger. Like we're committed to each other. Like, why would we want to negotiate this? Like, let's just go and do a good job. I don't think we'd want to be around for 10, 20, 30 years if we weren't getting along or weren't proud of the work we were doing. So like, sometimes, you read a contract and you can really tell, what people care about. And for us, it was, let's not take this as a given, but let's assume that Homebrew is the two of us. And frankly, also not necessarily more than the two of us. We knew from early on that we didn't want to add new partners to the mix.
Yeah. Well, it seems like of late, I don't know if you guys have observed, I feel like there've been a lot of founder divorces, like a lot of just firms like, and they say it really beautifully, but basically breaking up into, the founders go their own way, or that's a new strategy and one person goes to the big. Do you think that if you think that's true, is that just because people went straight from, meeting over a drink to getting married instead of, knowing each other for a while?
I'd say there's lots of reasons partnerships break up. I think we had the benefit of 10 years of history working together and building a friendship and working relationship. But even then, we probably spent 6 months just talking about like, are we going to be good partners, and do we want the same thing, and how do we want to spend our time, before we decided that we were going to move forward. And I think even more importantly is we've never stopped working on the partnership. And I think a lot of partnerships maybe spend time and invest energy into figuring out whether we should be a partnership, but not as many spend time on working on continuing to build and foster that partnership over the course of time. And that's because most partnerships operate kind of like a real estate firm, right? They share a roof and a shingle and a logo, but they kind of eat what they kill and operate pretty independently. And we've just never approached our work that way. And we've certainly never approached our partnership that way.
Yeah. And why is it that, and I think it's kind of a leading question, but it seems like, and we'll talk about solo founders in a second, but the two-person firm, there's something about it in Silicon Valley where a lot of the great seed firms, sort of have that model in a way that, look, any big, super successful multi-stage firm can stand up a seed program and resource it like crazy. But those don't seem to be the famous things that you really look to when you look to like what does a great seed firm look like? Is there some alchemy that occurs in the sort of two-person, but not five and not 50-person firm that just makes seed investing work?
I think, we, as Hunter mentioned, we wear a LP hat a lot. So we evaluate and spend time with a lot of firms that are getting started. And our view of venture is that there's not one model that works. What works is when you've got a person or a team of people who are executing a strategy and a model that's authentic to them. And just like with startups, you probably see more startup co-founders than you do any other number of startups. But I don't think that says anything specific about startup quality or the likelihood of success. And I think it's the same with venture firms. So I think that, if you think about the seed firms, like the early seed firms, Harrison Metal, Floodgate, Soft Tech, were one-man shops. Baseline.
Right.
And then you happen to have a first round, which was 3 partners, right?
Right.
Maybe 2 originally. And then you had Floodgate, which was Mike, and then Ann joined later. So I'm not sure that it's quite accurate to say that it's the 2-person partnerships that have been most successful. I think it's the groups and the individuals who have executed a strategy and a model that is based upon who they are as individuals that works best.
I think though that there is, given the nature of the stage and the economics and so on and so forth, if you think about a venture firm as fundamentally a number of partners, each, even though, Satya uses sort of the, each managing their own book of business, you do the math, and if you have a large partnership at seed, it fundamentally means you have a larger fund.
Right.
And, to the, your fund size is your strategy, sort of statement. I think it gets, we would suggest that it's harder and harder and harder to be a disciplined early stage fund and deliver above market returns when you start to get past certain sizes of AUM, And so I think there are some natural limiters on the upper bounds of seed. And so you could probably cluster, my guess is that sort of actually 1 GP and 2 GP firms are in a lot of ways more similar than, 1 and 2 GP firms are, and 5 GP firms, even though you might say like, well, isn't 1 the most unique because it's just a single GP? And I'm like, it's really once you cross sort of like an AUM barrier that things get a little bit different.
Yeah. Well, and we think of it from the ground up, right? We're just kind of simple country boys and have started a bunch of companies. And we say, well, in order to get from, and by the way, everybody with a fund bigger than $200 million will completely disagree. But in order to get from nowhere to somewhere that a Series A firm might care, you sort of need 3 to 5 really good people working for a couple of years. Like, it doesn't take one person. It takes a little bit more than that. And you can't do that for $500,000. Like, people won't work for free anymore. So you sort of need $2.5 or $3 million. And if you then just start working backwards from that, that gets you to, that's sort of a $10 or $12 million valuation. Okay, so that's the world of startups. If you're a VC who walks around and says, I need to put $5 to $7 million into a seed deal, that deal doesn't make sense to you anymore. And so I think what smart entrepreneurs do is they come and tell you a story to take your $5 to $7 million check, right? They say, no, I need 30 people working for 4 years to make this succeed. But my feeling is that what has happened there is that the fund size, the fund size is your strategy. The fund size has also forced the entrepreneur to make that their strategy. Is my sense.
There's a whole bunch of sort of, correlation, causation, like chicken and egg aspects to this last, this last decade, some of which I think we're doing a healthy, if not reconsideration on, and others which are just byproducts of, like you talked about, that, at seed, there's only so much dilution a founder will take. There's more and more funds with dry powder and who are realizing that concentrated portfolio whatever that means for you, whether it's 10 to 15%, 15 to 20% as a lead, or whether it's, trying to get to 3 to 5%, whereas before maybe you're happy to take less than 1%. And so all of those work together to sort of, let's call it like conspire to set a floor on, round size and dilution for, at least the top decile of startups, right? Like obviously, people could be listening to this who, on the founder side or the investor side, which this is not their personal experience at all. But if we're talking about like a typical quote unquote Silicon Valley, and I mean that in a, vibe sense and not a geography sense, startup, we're not going back to the days of, 750K on two, for a seed round.
Although you wouldn't know, everyone swears they were getting 20% ownership of these $5 million rounds. We don't see that. I will tell you that.
Well, I think, everyone might disagree on what the break point is in terms of fund size, but I think everyone would agree that the fund model introduces constraints, and that those constraints change with fund size. And I think most people would agree that the constraints increase as fund size increases. And that's playing out, or has played out, in all kinds of ways from the standpoint of VCs, but then to the conversation the two of you are having for founders as well, because it kind of forces VCs to behave in a particular way. And as a result, founders have to react to the game that's being played on the field.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, we switched, I'm sure we'll get to it, but like one of the reasons that we had always thought about switching to a more sort of personal capital model, essentially becoming our own LPs, we just, had thought that was going to occur closer to 2030 than 2022.
Right.
And the reason that, we decided with a fourth fund to become our own LPs was, a little bit of proactive and a little bit of reactive. Proactive is, hey, what are we waiting for? We've always wanted to do this. Are there skills or experiences we need to have, or is this just about sort of, when, what our risk profile is and when we're willing to take that risk? And then the reactive was, like you said, you play the game that's on the field, and that's sort of the growth and evolution of the industry over time, had made it, would have forced our hand to continue to get bigger as a fund, probably to a size that starts to increase the operational overhead, starts to sort of create implicit and explicit separation early and earlier between, what the founder is trying to figure out about their company and what you as an investor, want to see happen on a certain time scale. Right. And, we just found it, per earlier, like truer to the mission to sort of change the business model in order to not have to change, the mission, vision, values.
Well, as you come into the market, before you get to that chapter, you've got this first successful chapter, which is Homebrew, like the famous thing that we all know with LPs and all of that. How does that go, like, compared to what you guys think? I mean, my sense is that you guys, I had Mike Maples on the podcast, and he's one of the most thoughtful people in terms of analyzing every single investment he's ever made. He does it himself. He'll pull up a spreadsheet and show you, and he's got a thesis and a way to deal with everything. And then at the end, he kind of sums it up. It's kind of funny. Sums it up and says, yeah, and also I got lucky early. Meaning one of his early investments across the portfolio, one investment's going to do great, and it's probably all you talk about, and it's fantastic. And for him, it just happened to happen early, and he's like, that really helped. How did that part go for you? Did you have immediate hits out the door and it's fantastic, or did you have a lot of learnings and it developed? Or
listen, like, I think we've made some smart decisions along the way that we get some credit for, but the reality is we started Homebrew at the beginning of the greatest bull market in history.
Hey, good work.
Right? Like, it's always better to be lucky in terms of timing than anything else. And we were lucky in terms of timing. We're also the earliest of the second generation of seed managers, right? The greats that came before us that kind of laid the groundwork for us to be able to go do what we wanted to do. And we got that timing right. So yeah, we were lucky early. And as you appreciate in this business, like success or perceived success and reputation compound very quickly. Yeah. And so we benefited from that, but then we made some smart decisions along the way that established ourselves with both LPs and founders. So, you make your own luck, but there's no greater piece of luck than getting timing right.
Yeah. The two things I think that we did well, I think we structurally made a lot of good decisions, or at least thought about and talked about and were deliberate about who we were and who we weren't, so we were able to go to market with a sense of where we'd spend, you know, beginning statement about where we'd spend our time. We didn't set up anything from a firm structural standpoint that encumbered us, right? So very traditional, small, concentrated group of institutional LPs. So we weren't doing a whole lot of, you know, sort of weird LP management or,
Right.
you know, people, we were only in business with people we thought would be great to do business with. We already talked a little bit about the partnership dynamics and sort of, you know, process around stuff, but not being overly formal. And we didn't handicap ourselves by creating a portfolio, you know, model spreadsheet that suggested we were going to, you know, get in at incredible low prices or not experience dilution or, you know, punch above our exit weight, you know, in a way that had never been occurred before. So we sort of had a blueprint. And then the other thing I'd say is, even, you know, and that I sort of attribute a little bit to like the mix of, you know, Satya's background with some venture, but also like product thinkers. Like we both spent a lot of time, you know, in product management. And so we looked at, you know, this is our product.
Yeah.
Then I think, you know, people, especially when they come over from the operating side, they sometimes think that venture is about like, you know, ideas and whiteboards and so on and so forth. And it's sort of like the live to breathe, but don't, you know, don't breathe, you breathe to live, but you don't live to breathe. Like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff in it that's interesting and intellectual, but at the end of the day, it's investment management and sales. Like
Yeah.
you have to embrace and not forget that. And I think we did a superior job on the investment management side, taking advantage of moments through the bull market where we, you know, would take some money off the table from a secondary standpoint, or with early exits, we were aggressive recyclers. I think, what are we, like 119, 120% in fund one. So, you know, like, you know, we figured out how to take the set of investment decisions we made, some of which were good, some of which weren't, and, you know, play those out to the best of our abilities to, you know, quote unquote, you know, put some moolah in the kula, as you know, Chris Duvos might say, or
right.
you know, things like that. And so I think we did some of the things that gave us credibility to then raise successive funds and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So you're winning at venture capital. It's going well. It's interesting you say the thing about viewing what you have as a product, meaning you would do things like try to understand your product being capital that you want entrepreneurs to seek out. I assume you want them to seek out, because a lot of people have capital. They want your capital. And you would have times when I guess you'd see something, you'd say, well, that's a really interesting Series B deal. We really, it's kind of an area that we know. How
we
did we
did
miss
so many
that one?
things that I thought were just like commonplace, and it turns out weren't, to my surprise. Like we did, and now more people do these things, which is great because I think it is the evolution of venture. And I'm not saying that we came up with them. It's just maybe, you know, sort of people who are hitting the market at this time, you know, had similar backgrounds. But like we would do 360 outside led 360-degree surveys with our founders and our co-investors. When we started asking some of our peer funds about that, they either didn't do it or they had like their CMO send a survey to their founders, which was basically like an NPS score type of thing at best. And it wasn't learning about like really, you know, where are your blind spots, so on and so forth. We knew that a functional partnership probably had some of its own blind spots, right? Like even though we argue well, so on and so forth, the fact that we get along, you know, what does that mean? You know, what does our the strength of our relationship sort of blind us to? And so we did a lot of work on figuring out, well, how do we help? You know, what are the processes that we need in decision making that really force conflict, that force disagreement, so that the best decisions come out of it? We post-mortem misses. So not false negatives, not things that we had passed on that later became successful. That was a different process. But if we saw a deal get announced that we thought was sort of like in our strike zone and we didn't even see it, we would go figure out how to get in touch with the founders and better understand their fundraise process to see A, whether they knew about us or not. B, like, did they, did they not get to us? You know, did they sort of get taken off the table early? Did they not know about us? A whole bunch of things, not because, you know, we thought we were going to be able to solve every problem, every opportunity that would be boiling the ocean. But we sort of felt like we had a strategy that worked. And so if at any given time, we could pick one or two things to get better at. And those one or two things were things that were likely to repeat and that, were measurable in the way that we could improve at them, that we would just fund over fund, increase the likelihood of making one better investment per fund. And given our sort of track record so far, it turns out that like one better investment per fund is the difference between like good and great.
Yeah.
And so, you know, hopefully that compounds over time.
Yeah, I was going to say the power of compounding.
Yeah.
And it's funny that, like maybe great funds think alike, because as I recall, Mike Maples talked about how he thought there were 8 companies a year or whatever his thesis is. There's a certain number of great companies every year. And he would go back like 5 years and say like, okay, whatever it was, Uber, well, not a great example because he was in Lyft, but Uber started in this year. Where was I?
Yeah, I think, people, every once in a while, like, obviously we said, we passed on companies that later became successes. And then, like, obviously we sort of, try to understand, did we make, even if it was the wrong outcome, did we make the right decision? But you also just sort of, I mean, it sounds a little cliche, but it's like, God, if you're not seeing any companies that become successes, then like something's wrong. Like if you're not passing on any, something's worse than,
right.
It might mean you're not seeing any, right? So it's like, we sort of thought of it similarly, like numerator and denominator. If like the denominator is like all the top decile, we'd always say like top decile of startups being founded that year, and the numerator is like the number that sort of fit in our thesis areas, like in our geographies, because we didn't want to stretch ourselves too thin. So we started out kind of North America. We've since expanded to LATAM and South America, but we haven't done Asia. We haven't done Europe, blah, 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 blah. Like just trying to assess headwinds, like how good a picker do we have to be? Like, right. If it turns out that there's, let's just say 200 companies started each year that like have the chance to be, venture outcomes, obviously that number gets whittled down over time. Like, and we're not doing gaming, and we're not doing, deep stack, technology. We're not doing like storage and security at the time. Like, did we just half that number?
Right.
Did we take out? So we'd always just think of it that way. And then, as Satya said, you kind of just like go and play the game on the field. Like, you said earlier about, finding the right founders. And I think it's exactly that. It's sort of trying to figure out what type of startups would we be amongst the first 3 choices for a founder, and making sure that those founders knew about us and could reach us, or we could reach them.
Yep.
That was probably one of my biggest learnings. I think when I was on the operating side and doing some angel investing, like just being thought of as like a little bit of name recognition was sufficient. Like, oh, you're like Hunter, he knows about video, or Hunter, he's a good guy. Like that will get you like a 25K allocation in a round, but it's not enough just to be like, slightly preferred if you're trying to run a lead check strategy. So I had to quickly sort of shift to understand like what it meant to take a smaller group of people and really signal, sort of value and opportunity. Like you want Homebrew as, somebody you're talking to early, rather than just, be, mile wide, but inch deep.
Right. Well, and that worked out. And so here you are, 3 funds in. Let's talk about what you're doing now. Fantastic. Now it's time to go raise a $500 million fund with an opportunity fund, get all the LPs, the biggest LPs in the world. The sovereign wealth funds are going to come in.
God, even saying that makes me nauseous. I was going to throw like, I have fear of failure, and that sounds like failure to me. Like we could raise it, but the things we'd have to do in order to successfully deploy that would make me so unhappy. Yeah. Like we'd end up with teams and chiefs of staff and all these different stuff and processes. And then I'd be spending time fundraising. Yeah. Like we've never gotten on a plane to fundraise. It's so nice. And it's not easy. It's all hard, but it's also what you optimize for and what you focus on doing. And like, we're all mature. We know what it takes to run a business. I'm not going to try to like, say it's all, candies and sunshine, but like my happiest days, weeks, and months are when my calendar is filled with, me and Satya with a founder we're working with, me and Satya with a founder we might work with, right? Like that's all energy giving. Almost everything else is energy sapping.
Yeah. It was really easy to make the decision we made because like we said, from the beginning, it was all built around like how we wanted to spend our time and trying to build a product that we think was needed by the market.
Now, economically, it's stupid.
I was just going to say, the thing we did not optimize for was economics, right? Like we made...
And that's why I'm going to do a sponsor read right now. Homebrew is officially sponsored by Carta.
Exactly. We have some greens that'll help make you...
we would have done something different from the very beginning if we were optimizing for economics. And certainly the decision we made to move to our own capital wasn't about optimizing for economics, at least short-term economics.
Yeah. Even long-term, I don't think we can... I think it's very hard to beat the leverage you can get off of large sums of other people's money.
Yeah. I mean, at some point, I assume some of these famous companies that you can see, Homebrew invested in, Chime or whatever, anything can happen, but theoretically, they're going to exit their ways into the public markets at some point, and at least some liquidity to fund your next adventure.
Yeah, the way that we've just sort of done it is like, look, our fund four, when we switch to a personal capital model, it's in our fourth fund. There'll be other funds beyond that that'll be, for other purposes, things like that. But like essentially when we are entering a company with our own capital, it's Homebrew Fund 4 that shows up on the cap table because we kept everything together. We pay our team, we're talking to you from our, I guess, version 3 office down in Burlingame. Like
Nice.
we function as the same venture fund. It's just we became our own LPs. We go through the same, we still make about 10 to 12 investments a year, 80% of the time, they're probably, sub 500K checks every once in a while and seed. Sometimes we do larger and or later. But the original way that we've done it was just by sort of saying, great, let's set a budget, right? How much money do we think we need
Right.
to be our own LPs? And then you're absolutely right. Like that's phase one. Phase one is sort of true self-funding. Phase 2 is, as knock on wood for all of us, as the IPO windows, M&A windows, things reopen, can we start to resume distributions from the earlier funds? In addition to paying our mortgage, some of that will go into sort of our own this fund 4, and then can we hit a moment where we're evergreen, where the proceeds from the companies we're investing in last year, this year, next year just get recycled into this sort of fund structure. It's fund 4 because that was the one we were at, but it's also kind of Homebrew forever, right? So that's where the 4 comes in. It's meant to be an evergreen vehicle.
By the way, speaking of clever thing,
yeah.
who came up with Homebrew? That's got to be one of the best. That's up there. That's up there with lower. I don't even know if anyone knows what that means anymore, but that's up there with the lowercase capital.
Everything we do is collaborative, so it's 50-50. But I think what we are going for, we were joking, like we ruled out right away, like anything that had a type of tree
or a stone,
or a navigational element, or sailing. We don't sail, but it turns out when you're on your 7th fund and you start buying boats that you like to do, like outrigger capital and stuff like that.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's an outrigger capital. No offense. I'm a history major, and so like the idea of having something that has some historical meaning, the Homebrew Computer Club. We are all focused on disruption. So we look ahead, but we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. And the idea of sort of community was very important. So I got, as I just showed you, I got a
that's pretty impressive
logo a few months in, because for me, it was this was the first thing, like, leaving Google. He never thought I was going to leave Google, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I don't know whether this will succeed or fail. I hope it succeeds. We're going to work our ass off to do so. But I know it was the right decision to do it. And I want to indelibly capture this at the moment of decision, not at the moment of like, oh, hey, look, now we're successful. Now I'm going to get a tattoo, rock and roll.
I love it.
And I've only had to use that like 2 or 3 times to win deals.
Nice.
And I'd say the other thing that was important to us is we really felt like the product that was missing in the market at that time was a firm that committed not just capital, but also sweat and reputation.
Yeah.
And really the only way of executing against that promise was to have a concentrated portfolio. So kind of this notion of being artisan, handcrafted, hands-on was also, captured well by Homebrew. Yeah. We like,
weren't there some famous founders that came together?
Now than beer, but we still enjoy beer. And then, we're technologists, and there was a package installer on the Mac that was called Homebrew. So it just was a name that resonated a lot for lots of reasons, and it didn't take us actually very long to come up with.
We'd occasionally get support questions, and we'd forward them to the right.
That's right.
So Satya, the way Satya says it is like, the concentration of the portfolio made sense from a sort of investment standpoint, like how many outsized return, power law, and you own enough in those to return the fund. It also made sense in terms of what we thought needed to be bundled together for what the best founders are looking for, like the bundling of counsel and capital. One of the reasons that, when we were switching to the personal model and changing our check size wasn't just because, oh, this fits our needs, because the evolution of the world around us, we thought that there was maybe a new white space, and a white space that maybe we were if not uniquely, maybe particularly well qualified to inhabit, which is sort of like the flexibility and alignment of an angel, but like the gravitas and experience of an institutional. And it's not to say that like other people couldn't step into that, but you have like a lot of things you have to sacrifice a bunch of things in order to want to step into that space. That's right. And you also have to have proven a bunch of things to be able to step into that space. And so again, it wasn't driving into this notion of like, well, let's back into the best market position for us. But we've just always found that if we're true to ourselves and we try to be also true to what we think the founders we enjoy working with need from us, that we can usually find a sustainable business model rather than the sort of business model dictating the rules of engagement.
Yeah. How do we eliminate as many constraints as possible so that we can focus on working with founders who want to work with us?
Yeah, there's probably size constraints, right? Like we couldn't do this for 100 companies a year. That's why we're still doing 10 to 12.
Right.
But it's nice to have gotten started, and hopefully over the last 2 years have gotten a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. And per the compounding, my greatest hope is that we're even better at this tomorrow than we were yesterday.
It'd be weird if you got worse.
No, that it wouldn't be weird. That happens all the time. I think most of the investors who I grew up knowing have gotten worse, right? Like,
yeah, right.
And the nice thing is, because of power laws, you sort of, if you can recognize it and you can shift what you do from like, picking to mentoring, from sort of creating new networks to opening up your firm so that you're bringing in new blood. Like, I think there's very few people who are actually, truly better at this over the course of long periods of time doing the same thing. Like,
That's
I
fair.
think they either have to evolve or figure out, how to replicate. And the ones who are good at it, like even if they're not sort of hard, even if we don't follow in their footsteps deliberately, like you can learn a lot from them. Like I learn a lot from, the people who helped us along the way.
And
what else can
it is generally true in our industry that fund ones and fund twos outperform later funds. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, but I think it speaks to this notion that you do tend to get worse at your job.
I think it might be especially true. I mean, it'll be interesting to see now we have critical mass. I think it might be especially true with operators turned investors too. You hit the ground running for that first decade with like a lot of relationships. You're kind of like fingers on the pulse of what's going on in tech at the moment. And you're sort of exploiting that for a little bit of time. Then the question about, well, once more people know you as an investor than, head of product at YouTube or whatever, like, what does it mean to, sort of recharge your networks, have new perspectives on new technologies when you weren't building with them, all that type of stuff. I think it's,
and you certainly get
precarious for a lot of people.
I agree with that, but I also think that most funds suffer from strategy drift because most funds get larger. And so they end up doing something different than they did before, which may not be as authentic to them or as true to them as it once was, and instead is dictated by fund size or
the gravitational
team
pull
or whatever it might be.
All the incentives of gravitational pull is bigger. I know we're running out of time, but I'll tell one story. I think it was when we were going to raise the second fund? Like basically when we were going to raise the second fund, we had a very concentrated LP base in the first. We've always had very concentrated LPs, but especially in the first one, because we're like, look, the only risk we want to take is performance risk. If we're good at this, we want LPs that will come back. If we're not good at this, we don't care. Like we will leave. They don't have to fire us. So we're willing to sort of have a small number of LPs. And we're kind of doing our thing, and at a time where the market was starting to get frothy, a lot of people were deploying faster, larger, drifting off strategy, and we had stayed very focused. And the LPs that we had been in business with said, "This was great. You guys are very disciplined. We'd love to like increase our allocation." I'm like, no, that's part of the problem. Like you wanting to like triple down on your winners, is one of the things that, creates this sort of, well, now we've tripled our fund size. Like, are we going to, does the same tools, abilities, experiences we just had deploying a $35 million fund, which was the size of our first fund, like, does that hold true if we go to 350 eventually? Like, and I think, Satya, as you just said, like the answer is no. Like that's a different firm. It doesn't matter that it says the same thing or it's the same people deploying it. Like orders of magnitude differences in amounts of capital you're deploying, might as well be different firms.
Well, in a different arena too. I mean, if we became a Series A fund, people are like, oh, I just want to become a Series A fund. Well, we'd be competing with Sequoia and Benchmark. Like, why are we going to beat them? Like, I know why you want to invest us as a seed investor. I don't know if you would want us over, Sequoia or Benchmark or that battle, but people do. They move up into that realm all the time. So
people think about their fund not often enough as a product and try to figure out what product the market wants and why they might want their product. And I think it speaks exactly to what you're just talking about.
I also think there's a big difference like between like if I was going to compete with a Sequoia or Benchmark, I wouldn't compete by trying to be Benchmark or Sequoia, right? Like I think there's always, white space between the large firms, well,
that's what David Sachs is figuring out.
The question is like, finding it and defining that product has some constraints, right? Like, so it can only be so big. It can only do this, so it has to be the right match for the people.
But theoretically, that generally, I think it generally comes from people just being able to raise more money. So they do. So they have to be a Series A
Yeah,
fund,
of
and that's
course.
how they
Well,
got
it's,
there.
I mean, it's great. Like pay me millions of dollars, even if I'm
Yeah,
mediocre. Like
hard
we've
to argue.
never taken advantage of that, but it does sound nice sometimes.
Yeah.
The I think the question is also when you're thinking about like, who you want to be, it's, people say, well, it's a business about like seeing, picking, winning. I'm like, yeah, it's also about servicing and exiting.
That's right.
And I don't
Yeah.
think we've got like, other than, hey, we'll build an ops team, services, I don't think we have, I think there's a lot of generation of new VCs minted within the last 10 years that are still figuring out what like servicing and exiting looks like, not just
Yeah.
cheerleading.
Yeah.
And people say like, well, is venture is venture overfunded? I was like, well, the only way I know how to answer that is I look at every cap table we're on, and then there's at least, a few percentage points, if not more, of investors that I believe the founders, now knowing what they know, would swap out for somebody more useful to them.
Yeah.
And so until you have every founder telling me that 100% of their cap table is useful to them, I always think that there's room for a different type of investor. It might not just be that there might not be room for another carbon copy seed fund or another copy
right.
multi-stage fund, but there's certainly things missing from cap tables today.
Yeah.
Plug for Screendoor, which is why we're always looking for emerging managers.
I was going to
with
say
new
that.
networks and new faces who are thinking differently about venture.
I wanted to finish. Like, so you guys start another fund on the side that's an LP that invests in a certain type. Tell us about
That we
Screendoor
also
real
make
quick.
no money from. Why do we keep doing this, Satya?
Yeah, I think I know the. I think I know your problem.
We're Robin Hood. We steal from our dwindling fee structure to do all this other.
You make it up on
So, I
volume.
mean,
You make it up on
consistent with the idea that we're all standing on the shoulders of giants in technology, and as a result, many of us have benefited from the people who've come before us, opening doors and making it possible for us to take steps in our career. It's kind of obviously true that there are huge segments of the population that don't benefit from the networks that we all swim in every day. And so the theory of change of Screendoor is that we want to kind of recreate this virtuous cycle that many of us have benefited from in the technology industry, right? You have LPs give capital to GPs, GPs back founders, founders hire employees, companies go on to be successful, and those companies then generate wealth and expertise that funnels back into the ecosystem. And so our idea with Screendoor is like, how about we try to recreate that virtuous cycle for people who haven't been able to access it? And the right entry point is LP capital, because as an LP, if you're willing to back GPs who bring new perspectives, new experiences, untraditional backgrounds to the industry, they're empirically more likely to back founders who are like them, who are more likely to hire employees like them. And that money and that expertise will flow back into the ecosystem. And so Screendoor is an investment fund, fund of funds that provides both capital and, importantly, counsel to emerging managers who are starting their first funds and trying to bring those new ideas, perspectives to the industry.
Satya sounds very noble. Let me tell you what motivated me. So like you said, fund of funds, we raised from a bunch of endowments, foundations, so on and so forth, with some of our peers who also got involved. Kirsten Green from Forerunner, Charles Hutchin from Precursor. Basically a bunch of people who within the last 10 to 15 years had all built their own firms. I think I look for, when I'm hiring for Screendoor, what I look for is the same thing I have: love in my heart, but a chip on my shoulder. The love in my heart is that I think there are amazing new investors coming to market who could use capital. We do up to 10%, we target 10% of somebody's funds, so we can really anchor it, and provide some, ongoing people that they can turn to ask questions about, is this common? Like what did you guys do here? That type of stuff. Just the same way that founders have built relationships and founder networks. I love working with new emerging VCs as much as I do CEOs. The chip on my shoulder is, I think Darwin moves at like half speed in venture, right? For all the reasons we've talked about, funds last a long time. LPs don't want to swap out funds very frequently. So that if you've made the money in the past, they'll always give you one or more, two shots, blah, 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 blah. And so we don't have antiquated, less useful funds disappearing as often. And we don't have new firms benefiting, from scaling and succeeding as fast as they could or should. Entry into the industry is very difficult. And so what we wanted to do is help, a few dozen, maybe more over time. Probably this first fund will have about 18 or 20. So a considerable number of folks get started building their firms. And if we are right, not only will the bundle of those investments outperform, but it's essentially the seed round of the next generations of Homebrews, first rounds, Sequoias, so on and so forth.
Yep.
And so the chip on my shoulder is Homebrew is not meant to quote unquote disrupt venture. It is meant to disappear at some point, hopefully not for a very long period of time, but we never wanted to scale above the two of us. And we never wanted to be anything more than just kind of doing our thing. But we're product guys. And so you always love leaving something better for when you started it.
Yep.
And so the way that we leave venture better than when we started in it, besides sort of living our values and hopefully some companies that matter, is by releasing a few dozen of these highly competitive new managers into the ecosystem. It's better for LPs, they get more choices. It's better for founders, they get more choices. And hopefully it puts some of the VCs who are more mediocre out of business faster.
Yep. Well, it's all pretty inspirational. How's it going? Are you feeling, is it doing what you're supposed to do? You finding the right people? They're getting out there on
We were so
Screendoor?
lucky. So we got a great, again, it goes back to sort of product and structure, right?
Yep.
We got the structure right. The 10 of us sort of advising GPs, as I mentioned, Charles, Kirsten, Kanye, Aileen Lee, so on and so forth, the two of us. Then we got a great group of LPs, people who believe in, it's an economic vehicle with a societal mandate. So first and foremost, it needs to perform as an economic vehicle. We got a group of endowments and foundations who believe that there is incredible upside in the best fund one, fund twos from emerging managers, but know that their size and scale, the process that they do, deploying billions of dollars, doesn't give them the time or perspective to pick those winners. And so they're perfectly happy outsourcing that judgment to us who are on the ground. Then last year we added the perfect third component, which is the beginning of its own team, right? So this can't, if we're serious about this, it can't be something that we just do nights and weekends, although we will continue to do it nights and weekends. And we hired this amazing woman as a managing director, Lisa Colley out of Knoll, at a large family office who had invested in a lot of these firms. She's now building out a team. I don't know when this airs. That'll either be public already or soon that will be announced.
Yep.
And so those three, that's the three, sort of sides of the triangle. And what we have right now are already backed 14 managers, some of whom, new to venture, some of whom spun out of large firms. So it's not just kind of like the minor leagues. These are people sometimes with, oversubscribed first funds who we're able to get our allocation because they know that there's a difference between investing and firm building. And they want at least one LP on their table who's committed to helping them be firm builders. And that's the, sort of line item that we say, like, we think about it as how can Screendoor be as valuable in a, let's say, an increasingly competitive LP industry as Homebrew can be in an increasingly competitive VC one.
Yeah, well, I think the thing we can say with great certainty is we have incredibly strong product market fit with GPs who are getting started, kind of being an LP of GPs where they can get not just money, but also advice from people who are 3, 4, 5 clicks ahead of them and who are still on the field every day is incredibly valuable and differentiated. And for LPs, giving them exposure to a part of the asset class that is structurally really difficult for them to access is a winning combination. And we think something that we can build from to make Screendoor into the leading LP for emerging managers in the ecosystem.
One might suggest that over the last 10 years, just as venture went from being sort of a little more opaque and access was what got you into the game, and now it's much more competitive, much more open. Maybe the same thing is happening on the LP side, whereas before it was about, access, but now that it's global and there's, a lot of different dollars chasing the best, maybe we're going to see differentiated, LP stories and LPs that are, besides the enduring commitment of partnership, are looking to figure out how they can actually put their thumb on the scale for their managers, rather than a little bit more, the clockworker, clockmaker mentality of like, we'll fund them and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah. Well,
all right, we're out of time.
It's all really inspirational. It's all really inspirational.
But did you have questions for us?
What do you? No, I thought we had questions for you.
We just talked a lot.
That's my whole trick. Just let you talk, and it's fantastic. And it's inspirational what you guys have done. Like, it means a lot to, I think, a lot of people to watch how to build. There's a lot of ways to build a firm. I think you've done it thoughtfully. You've done it with a partnership, and there's a few of us with, we think kind of similar models that have just looked to it and thought that's something that those guys have done.
There's a group of, like we said, stand on the shoulders who came before us, and there'll be amazing VCs, who come after us. But there really is a cohort of folks who, some of whom we grew up with, before we started our venture firms, and others of whom we got to meet as we all sort of came to this space around the same time. And I do feel, it's sharp elbowed, but cooperative when
Yeah.
possible. And we just want to be the cooperative ones.
Well, and now how do people find you? Not LPs, because you're not doing that, but how does an entrepreneur find you guys?
There's
or follow you guys?
Screendoor, and you never know when institutional money can
That's
be
right.
brought along into great companies. So we are always happy to talk to LPs.
So is
Homebrew.co, homebrew.co. Our emails are on that as well, so feel free to reach out.
Now, Screendoor.co.
Screendoor.co. Clearly, we've invested in a .co domain. We haven't switched to .ai or other things like that.
All right.
And we're both here in the Bay Area. Now that we don't have a fund anymore, any VCs that want to buy us drinks or coffee, I won't even fake reach for the wallet to pay for the check. You have to buy me food. But it's been great.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Hunter Walk and Satya Patel, Homebrew and Screendoor have been my guests. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Ken.
Talk to you next time.
Bye.